Susan, thank you so much for being on the show. Not only are you a record producer, engineer, mixer, and audio electronics technician, you have a doctorate in psychology, studying music cognition, so much more from McGill, etc. And you have a great book called This Is What It Sounds Like. I've seen a ton of your interviews. I am super excited for this dialogue. So thank you so much for jumping onto the show.
Well, thank you, Ross and Cinnamon, for inviting me on this show. I'm really excited about it. This topic of creativity is one that's fairly new in neuroscience right now.
Mm,
So, reading about what it is and how it works is is really good right now. It wasn't well studied
right.
in the earlier decades, but there's starting to be some good data now on what it is.
100%. I'd be curious right off the jump, like what made you inspired to even go down the path of studying creativity at large, and thinking about it with that psychological like perspective and neuroscience back perspective as well.
I think it's what drives every scientist. You just think it's cool,
Right.
and you're curious, and we human beings have these we've got these clever brains, and, fortunately, we live in a time where it's not hard at all to get food and shelter for most of us. Of course, not for
Mm,
all people, but for most of us, we managed to get through the world okay, so we've got this extra free time going on
right.
up here, and, human brains just love to learn, and they tend to
Right.
be curious, and those of us who are cut from that cloth would rather exercise our minds than our bodies. We're not the
Right.
most physically fit group of
Fair.
individuals.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
Yeah, but we are the curious types.
I love it. Over the years, your background shows that you've hung out with some of the most curious, interesting, creatives, fascinating individuals in history, I would even say. And I saw one interview in particular where you were chatting with some folks around the experience working with Prince, and how Prince would arrive to create. Would you be able to give us a bit of a rundown on what that experience was like and how Prince set himself up for success?
Mm. Let's start by establishing that Prince was no mere mortal, and,
Mm,
I'll give you an anecdote. An engineer named Dylan Dresdow, who worked with Prince in the 2000s, was on a panel with me, and we were asked these questions, and he said something I'll never forget. He said, "After you worked with Prince, you had to unlearn Prince."
right.
So, I don't want any young record maker out there listening to think that what I'm about to describe is how it's done by most people.
Mm,
It's not. But, the way he would work is, he'd sometimes come into the studio with a song and sometimes not. So,
right.
when we were not on tour, when we were making a record, because he was either making a record or was on tour making a movie, we'd either work at home in his home studio in Chanhassen, Minnesota, or we'd work in Los Angeles at Sunset Sound. This is before Paisley Park Studios was built. So
Right.
I'd usually get a call either from him or for someone on his staff in the morning telling me to come in to the studio. It would usually wake me up because I'd usually only have a few hours of sleep, but get that phone call. You get the phone would ring, and you'd pick up the phone and you'd hear that deep voice of his say, "Ready?" Or sometimes it would be, "Susan, can you come in?" And you always say yes, of course. "Yeah,
Right.
yeah, yeah, be right there, boss, be right there." And you just get a fast shower and you get down to the studio. So often I'd race down to the studio and he wasn't there yet, but there'd be a note on the console that says, "Can you set up this, that, and the other thing? This is the instrumentation I need." Now, what he meant by that was, if you could just please route the signal for every one of these instruments so that he could do what he loved to do best, which is come in
Mm,
and work in silence. Well, silence for talking. He wanted to just go drums, bass, keys, guitar, lead vocal, backing vocals, ornamentation. If he could just go bam, 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 bam through each instrument, the guy was so hyper creative that his ideas just kept flowing. So
mm,
I would come in, I'd see a note a lot of times that said acoustic drums or drum machine. Sometimes I'd come in and he'd already be there, and I'd have to
right.
walk really, really fast just to get everything set up for him to go because he just worked so quickly. He generally, I want to go on record as saying, was generally in a good mood.
Mm,
So you hear about rock stars and you hear about
right.
these superstars being temperamental and throwing things and having tantrums. Not Prince. I don't
Mm,
know what he was like with his girlfriends or his friends. I won't speak to that. But in the studio, I assume everywhere else, if
Right.
he was having a bad day, he'd just get quiet.
Mm,
Just quiet. He'd go into himself and he'd shut himself off and he'd just work, work, work. But most of the time, he'd arrive and he'd be in a good mood and just move
right.
from one things to the next. He was in his happy place. There was nothing else he'd rather do than either be in the studio creating
Right.
or be on stage performing. That's what
Mm,
he did. That's how he filled his days.
right. And for you, thinking back to that time, like, talk to me a little bit about the joy of doing that type of work for yourself. Like, that's demanding work. Could you take me back into time a little bit about your mental perspective on that type of environment and to be there and to be working on it? What was that like?
Imagine this. So I was starting my career in 1978 when Prince's For You album came out, his first
Right.
album. And
Right.
I listened in Los Angeles at that time. There were 2 R&B stations, KJLH and KACE. Those were the stations. And
Right.
you go back and forth between those 2 stations. And the very first time I ever heard Prince, I was on a bus going down Sunset Boulevard, and there was a kid in the back where I was sitting, and he had a boom box, and Soft and Wet came on. And I just
Right.
remember thinking, whoever this artist is,
Right.
I need to know more about this artist, and I think as I recall, I stayed on that bus. I missed my stop because I wanted the DJ to come on and say who this
Who
was.
it was. That's awesome.
So, I was intrigued from the downbeat,
Right.
quickly became a big fan, had all of his records, saw him play at Flippers in Los Angeles on the Dirty Mind tour. I will never forget
Right.
mind being blown on that tour. It's crazy, crazy, crazy. So I'm in the 1999 tour. So he was my favorite artist in the world.
Right.
And then one day in the summer of 1983, my an ex-boyfriend who's still a dear friend, he called me and he said he was at Westlake Audio as a technician, and he said Prince put the word out through the grapevine. He wants to hire a full-time technician from New York or LA to move to, Minneapolis, be his full-time tech, and that's what I was. I was a technician working for Crosby, Stills& and Nash. As soon as I
Right.
heard that, I just knew instantly, that's my gig, that's my job. So, to answer your question, when I was in the room with him making
Mm,
music, I was well aware I
right.
had what I considered to be the greatest gig you could ever possibly have, and all
Right.
I wanted to do was to facilitate his creativity and his work
Mm,
so that other people would get to enjoy his music, as much of it as possible, so I worked really hard to
right.
be his audio signal router to facilitate his creative ideas, get those ideas onto tape, get them off tape, get them mixed so that we can put records out there into the world as fast as possible. It truly was, for as hard as it was also a dream job.
Right. And how hard it was, did that reflect Prince's work ethic as well? Like, how did
Oh,
Prince's work ethic play into all of this?
Ross, one of the reasons I admired and respected him so much was that incomparable work ethic. He used
Mm,
to say things like, when he'd be having a dilemma about which direction to go, professionally, he didn't discuss those personal things with me, but, sometimes we'd be alone for a long time and he'd just feel like talking, so he'd talk, and there was a
right.
phrase he would use a lot. He'd say, "We put bread on people's tables." He used the
Mm,
word "we" a lot, and he took his responsibilities as an employer, as a
right.
boss, very, very seriously. When the
Mm,
when he was 25, 24, 25 years old, he had a staff of people working for him,
right.
musicians and technical people and management. He recognized, now I'm employing people and I owe it to them to do my best.
Right.
He's well known that he was religious, and so, he believed that he had been gifted with a talent and that
Mm,
he would be doing a disservice to the God that he believed in if he didn't work as hard as humanly possible without
right.
complaint.
Mm,
You can hear from my voice, I'm suffering from a cold right now, and I was thinking about how when we were on tour, he never, the whole time I was with him, ever canceled a show. He was immortal. He'd get colds and flu like other people. He'd
mm,
take Dayquil backstage.
right.
He'd just be
Right.
drinking that Dayquil. He'd get on that stage. He just believed, if you have the chance to do this, you have to do it. That's your job. And he took that very seriously. I was proud to adopt that work ethic and to keep
Mm,
pace with him for as long as I could because it just seemed like the right thing to do.
Right. Take the listener back into time. I want them to be able to really grasp and see or kind of sound or hear what it would feel like to like see this work ethic in person. Like
Hmm.
you get that call, you show up, Prince might be there, might not be there. When you do go home, like what happens between that first moment when you arrive and then the conclusion? Like what's going on that demonstrates like this level of work ethic that you're describing?
Yeah, um, just unreal. So let's pick a song that was a piano ballad because his pop songs were generally written on piano first. So he'd
Right.
have melody and he'd have lyrics, and he knew the song before we started recording. So he would play acoustic drums or program the electronic drums. Other times, he'd come into the studio and he wouldn't have a song, he would
Mm,
just get a groove going, he'd get a drum
right.
groove going on the drum machine, figure out a bass part, he'd have a key in mind, have some changes, and he'd actually write as we were
Right.
recording, making things up. But let's take a typical day where he had written something that he'd been playing with for a while. I'd get that note saying that he wanted the piano mic'd and all these other things, and sometimes he'd specifically say, "I want a long reverb or a short reverb," or something like that. And, everything is I'd go as fast as I could. One of the notes he wrote to me down at the bottom, he wrote, "Save my blood pressure, please." Meaning the faster you work, the more I can get done. So,
Mm,
get everything going. So he would just come in, and on something like that, a song that was piano based, it would often start with him on acoustic drums. And
right.
here, this is the most amazing thing you'll ever see in the recording studio. You put the tape machine and record, he'd get on the drum kit, no headphones, because he's not playing to anything, no click or anything, no headphones. He's just on the drum kit, playing the track from top to bottom, keeping track of bars, of course, putting in all the breaks and all the fills with the music in his head completely
Right.
top to bottom. How do you do that and stay in perfect time? He did.
Right.
So you lay down the drums and, we did dance music versions of so many of his records that it often didn't just go for 3 or 4 minutes. I mean, he'd sometimes play for 6, 7 minutes. Anyway,
Right.
lay down the drums. He'd come into the room. I would have tuned the bass to have it all ready to go, hand him his bass. He'd sit down, do the bass part. He might next go upstairs and play the piano. We'd record that. And just the two of us, just communicating back and forth. Come down, do keyboard pads, do his guitar parts. Then there's a time when a record could go either way. It's either
Mm,
turning out really well and it's going to probably make an appearance on your next album, or
right.
more often than not, it's okay, but it's not good enough for this next record. He might give it away to one of his protege bands. He might
Right.
save it for a later album. But there's a moment where you kind of know
Mm,
what its destiny is. And when that
right.
moment comes, whether it ends up in the vault or it ends up on a record, now you kind of relax because now you know what it is. So that's
Right.
when he'd get talkative. He'd usually call Eric Leeds, have Eric Leeds come down and put saxophone on. Or he'd call
Right.
Wendy and Lisa and they'd come and add parts or backing vocals. So that's when you can kind of relax because, all right, you've just created something and you can see and hear what it
Right.
is.
Right.
Those long days would go 16, 20, 24 hours, that was not unusual. Then what
Right.
would happen is, he'd give you some last minute instructions, the next thing he wanted done, do this or that, send this cassette to somebody or just whatever. Yikes. Then he'd go upstairs to get ready for bed, and I'd be wrapping up, and
Right.
I'd hear those feet come down the stairs, and I thought, "Here we go." And sure enough, he'd come down the stairs, and sometimes he'd say, "Can we go around again?"
Right.
Meaning he
Right.
had another song, and I remember once, he actually said he apologized one time, he apologized, he said,
Mm,
"I'm sorry," he said, "I was brushing my teeth, and this groove just came to me. I gotta do it."
that's
And, of course,
that's
you always say, sure, of course."
right.
That's what
Right.
you do, and you put up fresh tape, and off you go around
Wow,
again.
that's amazing. I love it. Thank you so much for diving into that. I really appreciate it. Something that you've talked about in the past was like the limitations within the studio. How did you see Prince creating independent elements in like their arrangements throughout his process and like use limitations at large to kind of create some of the best work?
Ah, he was so smart, smart, smart. I'm gonna take a sip of tea.
Feel free.
So he was a genius with his arrangements, in addition
Mm,
to being a genius with rhythm and melody. Um, we always worked 24 track analog. Many artists in the 80s would link together two 24 track machines, giving themselves 48 tracks, minus one
mm,
for the minus two for the time code. Prince was too impatient to wait for the two machines to roll back in sync, start up, lock, drive him crazy. So all of his arrangements needed to fit onto 24 tracks.
right.
If you think about today with digital audio workstations, people are making records with 300 tracks, more in some cases. So they'll create a snare sound by layering 8 individual snare sounds to create one snare. But in
Right.
the days of 24 track, you just had to choose your sounds
Mm,
before you hit that record button. The kick that you
right.
record is on one track, and that's your kick drum. Same with your hat and your snare and your cymbals. So you had to be really decisive. The other thing you had to do is sort of kind of plan your arrangement in advance. So you'd know how many tracks to leave for keyboard parts. Will they be stereo or mono? For backing vocals, how many tracks you gonna need for backing vocals? All that kind of stuff. Prince had I wrote somewhere that he had a watchmaker's talent
Mm,
for looking at, like, the shell of a watch and
right.
imagining how all those little pieces were gonna go and fit together. Brilliant, brilliant, brilliant arranger.
Mm,
Perfect example. I was just thinking of this last night. One of my favorite songs of his that I love more than anything is Condition of the Heart on
mm,
the Around the World in a Day album. It's got a long, long intro. All these
right.
different timbres coming in and out. He did all that, just one instrument after the other, as if he could hear the whole song in his head.
Right.
That's unheard of. I mean, you don't see that in the normal world. The normal world, I should say, of some really brilliant people.
Right.
Let me please say, back to Dylan Dresdow and saying you had to unlearn Prince. Now, Dylan had worked with some really big artists before he joined Prince, so he knew how
Right.
normal people made records. I did
Right.
not.
Right.
So for me, for Wendy and Lisa, Prince was our first real
Right.
professional experience. So when I left Prince, I now am entering the world of other record makers, and I'm learning how normal people do this, and
Right.
truly, it seemed outrageously slow. I
Right.
could not believe we would spend the whole day, I'm not exaggerating, a whole day to get one guitar part. Prince
Right.
would get a whole record in one day. So at first, I had to overcome that
Mm,
impression that, wow, these people are just not as creative or they're just not as
mm,
fast or they're just not as decisive. I was wrong.
right.
Very creative. They're very decisive. They're using the studio for trial and error. They're revising their drafts. All the great writers, authors, they revise their drafts. They do a first draft, a second, a third, and fourth, whether they're writing for the screen or television,
Mm,
writing novels. It's what we do.
right.
Most people aren't afraid of that, but Prince had zero interest in that. He wanted to get it right the first time and only time.
Mm, mm. And when some people aspire to be Prince, and like you come across up and coming musicians who probably like set the bar as like someday I want to be that, what is the thing that they don't understand about Prince that made Prince Prince and
Hmm.
different from so many others? You've said hyper creative, you've used that phrase, and I've heard you say it a lot. Is that it? Is that what made Prince so different? Or what is it that you
Oh
would
my
say
goodness.
differentiates?
Quite a lot of things. Um,
Mm,
we talk about the distinction between art and craft. Art is original thought, your ideas, your creativity. Craft is your ability to make manifest the things that you think of. And wrapped up, your art and your craft are wrapped up in your psyche, your capacity to focus, self
mm,
discipline, tune out distractions,
right.
work when you're not in the mood to work, perform a really happy song when you're feeling sad, all those things. So all that has to come together. Prince's craft was something he began honing when he was a child. It's
Mm,
publicly well established that he had an abusive childhood. For periods of his childhood were really, really bad, and there were times when he was locked up in a bedroom, and that poor kid, junior high school era, I think, that kid would just practice playing like a fiend because he needed to escape from his humble origins and realize his dreams. Andre Simone tells the story. Andre was Prince's bass player in his first band. Andre tells the story of when Prince came to live with them. The Simone family, they were happy to take another kid, and they all went to high school together. And the kids would all come home from school, and they'd run downstairs to the basement. There's a little bit of recording equipment there. The kids would play around, and they'd impress each other. And then it would be time for dinner, and time for homework, and time for TV, and time for bed. But Andre would say, and then you'd come downstairs in the morning, and Prince would be coming up in the same clothes he had worn the night before,
mm,
and he'd hand you a cassette and say, "Check out what I did last night." So this
right,
kid, not only was he so facile on instruments that he could move from drums to bass to keys to guitars to vocals, doing everything himself. I mean, he had tremendous technical skill, but he
right.
coupled the craft with tremendous artistic creativity. That's a potent
Mm,
package. Now nestle that in the psychological package of someone who had focus,
right.
self-discipline, a work ethic, an overarching plan. He was happy to look down the road and see where he wanted to be in a few years. He just was all these amazing things all coming together to forge an almost perfect musical superstar. Um,
Right.
Careers in the music business don't last very long. Even at the highest level, you're going to have a pretty short run of being on
Right.
top, top, top.
Right.
But he made that work, and as I said earlier, he achieved that superstardom at a very tender age,
Yeah.
25 years old.
In your book, this is what it sounds like. You described the Triple Crown, where you talked about how there's like critics providing fame, the public providing that sense of being loved, and musicians providing respect. There's no question that I think still, even to this day, Prince still has like the crown in many ways in the
Mm,
work that he's done. And there's others that have like been able to like get to close to that. Could you talk a little bit around like that idea of the triple crown
yeah.
and um, how you would view the best path for a creative to even aspire and get there today if they wanted to?
The Triple Crown is really rare and difficult to hit. It's
So
like being an EGOT, and if you're
it's
a
so,
young actor or something like that and you plan, "Okay, I'm gonna win these 4 major awards." Stop.
I
Stop.
know.
Yeah,
Yeah.
not that you can't do it, but why on earth would
Right.
the first mountain you climb be Mount Everest?
Exactly.
Climb a few little hills, work your
Right.
way up to a few mountains, and you get there. But you
Right.
don't wanna set yourself a task that's gonna be impossibly difficult. You
Right.
just might get there, but
Right.
find first you have to accomplish something. Show
Mm,
that you can actually be world-class great at a simple task and work your way up. So the Triple Crown refers to the different listening audiences there are for our
right.
musical work. There is the general public, that's the listeners we think of most of the time. There's other musicians who don't listen with the same ears as the
Right.
general public. They tend to
Right.
be snobbish, and they're listening for whether or not they or their friends could have done that. They're snobbish. I know these kids at Berklee. That's just how they are. That's musicians. And then the third audience is a really important one. That's the music critics and scholars, the
Mm,
writers, the journalists. They're listening for ideas whose time has come. And just like food critics and movie critics, they want to say, "You guys, you gotta see this movie. It's amazing." Or "Don't waste your money. Stay home. This movie's no good." So they're all listening for something slightly different, which is why it's impossibly difficult,
right.
nearly, to please all three audiences.
Right.
The one record rarely does that, and certainly you don't do that throughout your entire career. The example I gave in the book of someone who did do that, for a long stretch of time, probably wore the crown the longest, was Duke Ellington. So
Right.
Duke Ellington was the country's most popular band leader.
Yeah.
Other critics revered him, and musicians just thought he was a god. So
Right. Yeah.
really, really hard to do.
Right.
Not Michael Jackson, not the Beatles, not Jimi Hendrix, who was a musician's musician, but didn't sell as many records as Eric Clapton. I
Right.
mean, different audiences. Prince wore the Triple Crown for, the Purple Rain album.
Right.
It was a number 1 hit record with the public. Other
Yeah.
musicians were like mad respect, and,
Right.
and the critics and scholars, praised it, as a masterpiece. So,
Yeah.
he wore
I
it
love
for a short time.
short time. Yeah. It is one of those things that like you even I think when I was reading it, I was like, this is applicable to so many different industries
Mhm.
as well. Like in a lot of different spaces, there exists like that triple crown, whether you're thinking music, whether you're thinking art, you're thinking books, like that type of concept exists in all elements of creativity and creative outlets. Um,
Exactly.
yeah. How
Yeah.
do
I was gonna say, and don't forget food. Food is such a good
food, right?
analogy with music
Great one.
because music is different from visual art and paintings, it's different from movies because you can consume it so rapidly. 3 minutes,
Right.
you can consume a taco or you can consume a record in just a few
Right.
minutes. So, no one would argue that McDonald's makes the greatest hamburgers in the world. But
Right.
McDonald's probably sells the greatest number of hamburgers in the world. Different
Right.
audiences. A gourmet audience is gonna be different from the
Mm,
general public, which will be different from the food critics, and we're
right.
okay with that. We like living in a world where you can choose the thing you wanna interact with based on what you need it to do for you. The public
Right.
just wants a fun little record to give them an earworm, and this sounds good, and it's joyful, but the critics are
Right.
looking for art whose time has come, and other musicians are looking for inspiration. So,
Mhm.
they function differently.
Right. Yeah, no, I love that. I appreciate it. So one of the major themes of the show is creation. We talk about creating music, we talk about creating art, creating companies, stories, so much more. And that phrase hyper creative is something that I want to just double click on a little bit. Could you describe to me what your definition of a hyper creative is?
When I did a little bit of research into creativity, I learned about a couple of circuits in the brain that have to open themselves up to
Mm,
allow creative ideas to flow. When we very first get inspired, the first moment of creativity, your brain is wandering. In fact, mind wandering is the best precursor for a creative thought. And we mind wander in the shower or taking the dog
mm,
for a walk or when we're idling, sometimes driving in our car, we turn the radio off. We just let our minds go where it wants to go. And if you let it off its leash and you let it wander, sometimes it'll investigate something and it'll go, yeah, yes, that's a good idea. I could do that. Now, when that happens, there's a little circuit on the right side, kind of the right back, called the precuneus. And that little guy says, all right, then let's go. Not a bad idea. Not a bad idea. So that's where art originates. And that precuneus starts reaching out to other areas and it starts opening its little gates so that you can allow your creative ideas to flow. So, if I were to do this, what would I need to do? And you get enough original thought going on in there. And the precuneus passes the ball to another circuit, also on the right hand side, that is the craft part. And that
mm,
circuit says, "All right, then let's go. First, we need to build this, and then we need to build that, and then we need this piece of gear, and here's the practical method for making
right.
this thing come into being." In folks who are hyper creative, their precuneus and that other little circuit have a couple of faulty gates that you
Mm,
can think of as leaky faucets. Now,
right.
our brain is in inhibitory mode nearly all the time with 89 billion neurons up there. At any given moment, a human could say or do anything, but they
Mm,
don't. They choose from an appropriate set of actions and words, and all the rest of the brain just keeps its little brakes on. Um, so inhibition is something that the brain naturally does. But if your little precuneus and the right temporo parietal junction have faulty breaks, what that means is your creative ideas just keep coming and coming and coming. So, as you're passing the ball from art to craft, the new art keeps coming. Now, the
Mm,
precuneus is tasked with separating relevant from irrelevant information. So, if I've
mm,
decided that I don't know. I need to design something. I'm terrible at this, but suppose I had to design a logo or some stupid thing like that.
right.
I'd have
Yeah.
to open up that precuneus and think, "Oh, what would it be? What would it look like?" And as soon as I get a single good idea that I think is a
Mm,
good idea, I'd say, "Okay, great. Shut the gate, move over to craft, and now start figuring out how to design this thing." But for folks who are hyper creative, it just stays open. So,
right.
Prince seemed obviously a hyper creative because of, that tendency of his to just have songs coming and coming and coming. We needed to work so fast because he
Mm,
often had another song in the queue just waiting to
right.
get out. The next circuit is responsible for, revisions, being open-minded to rethinking something, which Prince would also do on
Mm,
occasion, not a lot, but he'd do it on
right.
occasion, and that 2nd circuit is so strong in the craft modality that that 2nd circuit can is not it doesn't have a problem with saying, "Alright, I wanna try it like this, and now I wanna
Mm,
change, and I wanna try it like that, and I wanna try it like a 3rd way." The only other person I've known in the music business, I think has a couple of faulty circuits in both of those structures because 'cause you'd be getting ready to hit record on the stereo
right.
tape machine and print a mix, and he'd go, "Wait!" The ideas just kept coming and coming and coming. He's
Right.
one of the most creative people I know.
That's fascinating. Do you think it's nature or nurture in terms of hyper creative?
I'm pretty sure it's nature. I think,
Mm,
I don't know what causes those circuits to form in
right.
infancy and what's responsible for those leaky faucets, the
Right.
broken gates there. I don't know enough about it. Uh But in a lot of cases, we're born into this world, we're sampling sights and sounds and smells and tastes and textures, and our brain is, pruning any
Mm,
connections that it says, "Well, I don't need this. This isn't
right.
important," and it's making stronger connections with, those kinds of stimuli that you do need. So,
Right.
if in your world say your family goes bowling a lot. I don't know why I thought of
Right.
bowling, but let's
Right.
say they go bowling.
Let's do it.
And they yeah, and they take the infant along. The baby's gonna learn really fast
Mm,
the sound of that bowling ball and those pins striking, and baby's brain is going to recognize, "This is something the family's
right.
really into. This is
Right.
something that's important in my world." But let's say you never go water skiing, so you don't hear those sounds, you're
Right.
gonna, you're not gonna form such strong connections there. Our brains are
Right.
constantly organizing themselves based on what we're exposed to.
Right. I love it. And when an idea is coming to life within these brains of ours, how does that happen? A creative idea is starting to arise. Like, how does that take place?
Um, they talk about it in terms of mind wandering and spontaneous thought and the default
Mm,
network. So, a hot topic in neuroscience right now is something called the default network. What it is down deep in the brain, it's an interconnected set of brain nuclei that are responsible for our self image, self consciousness, self awareness. It's your sense of self down
right.
deep inside. There are also some circuits in there that are involved with approach and retreat behaviors where you might be shopping, let's say for clothing. And look, I mean, the human brain is constantly keeping a running stream of decisions. So you're
Mm,
shopping and you're looking through this rack of shirts and you're going, no, 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 until you happen to see one that causes your sense of self to say, this is me. This could work
right.
for me. I'm intrigued by this. And you might select it and try it on. So it works the same way. So anyway, there's the default network, and when we're asleep, we don't put any constraints on it because we can dream
Mm,
whatever we want to dream. Our brain's going to go wherever it wants to go or needs to go when we're dreaming. But when
right.
we're awake and we're doing what a brain does a lot, 30 to 50% of the time, we go into our own heads.
Mm,
That's good for a brain. We evolved to switch back and forth between the outside world and the world of our inner thoughts.
right.
You go into your inner thoughts sometimes, like if you're doing a podcast, you can't go drifting too far off because it'd be socially embarrassing. So you kind of have to pull it back. But if you're taking a long car trip or a long hot shower or something like that, you're free. You're free to let your brain think whatever it wants to think. So
Mm,
mind wandering occasionally causes a brain to come up with an idea that it recognizes as novel and
mm,
useful. The components of creativity include original, it's got to be
right.
novel, and useful. It has to serve some
Mm,
function. Folks with mental illness will come up with all sorts of creative ideas, but it's not ideas that a lot of people can use. So you
right.
might come up with an idea, and that is going to open up the precuneus, and that precuneus is going to get more connected to your sense of self, and your creative brain, is now
Right.
working in a way that is unique to you, filtered through the craft that you have at your disposal. You may be able to do some of it by yourself. You may have to team up with a partner or an expert to complete some of the other tasks. You had asked earlier about the difference between Prince and a lot of other artists who want to do everything themselves. I've never met a single one who could
Mm,
sing at the level at which he sings, plays
mm,
drums, plays bass, plays keys, plays guitar, all at the level that he was
right.
capable of. He could do everything himself, and, not many people can do that.
No, it's true. It's a rare, rare, once in a lifetime.
Yeah.
Like I tell people all the time, if Prince was, I think it's like 500 or so years back, like Beethoven, like those names
Mhm.
would be at the level. Prince would be there, right? Like the amount of creativity and excellence in the work is just spectacular. I think
Yeah.
I appreciate that.
Imagine who he would have been, in the 19th
Right,
century or the 18th century. Imagine.
right.
He loved Gustav Mahler. I imagine if he was the same brain, he would have created, big dynamic
Mm.
pieces. He loved that.
Right. That's awesome. I love that. One of the things that stood out in your book, and I don't have a music background, so it blew my mind, was musical dimensions and aesthetic dimensions. This was something that you talked about as like throughout the book, like the melody, the lyrics, all of these different dimensions of music. Could you just elaborate for some folks who listen to music, probably like me, where we just enjoy it? We just love to hear it and feel it, but we don't think about the
Mm,
dimensions of it. Could you just talk a little bit about the dimensions that go
right.
into great music?
So when you listen to a record, there are at least 7 different ways that your brain can get a treat from listening.
Mm,
By treat, I mean your brain can release a little bit of opiates or dopamine that makes you say, "Oh, that was sweet," makes you happy. The default network that I mentioned earlier is intimately connected with the dopaminergic reward system because the default system is involved in approach and retreat behavior. So you check out something brand new, maybe it's a new food or something, and you think, "I don't know if I'm going to like it. I'm not sure." But you take a little bite. If it works out for you and you like it, you release a little dopamine and you're like, "Yes, this is
mm,
now a new food that I like." You form now a connection between the taste of that food and your happy place. You like it. So throughout the course of our lives, we're hearing music all the time. We're not always paying attention to it, but imagine you're in the car, you're with your family, and you're going someplace and you're happy. Let's say you're 4 or 5 years old. You're happy. You're with your family. You're going someplace. Maybe it's a holiday or something. And everybody's in good mood and the radio is on. You have coursing through your body a lot of feel good neurotransmitters. Song comes on. The neural pattern of activation of a certain song, maybe a song, let's say, that matches the mood you're in, something that's really happy, seems like the perfect expression of what you're feeling right now. This is
mm,
happening to us automatically as we grow up and encounter music in the world. What ends up happening is these positive and negative experiences allow each one of us to form a unique listener profile. Each one of us has a sweet spot on the dimension of rhythm where a
mm,
groove just feels like perfect for us. Sweet spot in lyrics where the lyrics just send you over the moon, you think it's brilliant. A sweet spot in melody. You like certain melodies that may be wide versus narrow or major, minor key more than others. A sweet spot for sounds, for timbres. I like the old fashioned, those deep dish snares. I like a low tuned snare. A lot of people prefer the high poppy piccolo snare. And there are these three aesthetic dimensions that get activated when we appreciate all art, which can be fashion, or it can be movies, or it can be books, where you just think to yourself, in my
No worries.
opinion, this is the perfect way to write a novel in the English language. This is the perfect way to act in a scene. This is the perfect way to design a scene with the set decoration. We have all these sweet spots, and that's what makes us all unique listeners.
I love it. That's amazing, and I think the unique listener is another important piece of the book that you talk about a little bit around listener profile and how we identify ourselves as engaging and being interested in different types of music. One of the things that also happens is like the shift in taste of music and what you like can evolve and can change. It's like a kid. You give a child sushi when they're 4 years old, they're going to think it's nasty. But you give them sushi when they're 35 and they think it's the most delicious thing in the world. Could you elaborate on how the brain changes to make room for something that at one time felt, but now as you age and things differ in your life, might be amazing and exactly what you want?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I assume a complex answer. I wish I knew more about the development of taste for food to see how that
Right,
comes online. We all know that
right,
that it evolves as we get older, but I don't know the stages of that. Um,
right.
when it comes to music, we little children actually do not like sad songs. It
Mm,
actually can make them sad, and they really don't like it. When they get a little bit older, they start to form a little bit of an appreciation for it. Another interesting fact, little children are often suspicious of kids who like what we would call foreign music. So let's say you're 7, 8, 9 years old, new kid comes to class, is from some other country in the world. You are comparing notes and you ask this kid, "What kind of music do you like?" The kid plays music from his or her home country, and if it's really different from your music, you're gonna feel this apprehension. This
mm,
is because when we are children, we're starting to recognize that music represents our clan, our
mm,
tribe, our people. You're starting to see music as a representation of your society. And kids who listen to different music than you aren't
mm,
you, they're not your people, so you
right.
tend to feel suspicious. Then you get a little bit older and you get into high school, and now you're a little bit more adventurous. And boy, this is a scary thought. I don't have children, but if I did, it would scare me. Teenagers are mostly concerned with how they appear to
Mm,
other people in their social environment. Teenagers are nothing in their world matters more to a teenage brain than what the
right.
other kids think of them. So you need to establish your identity in high school if you're going to be part of a smaller group. A
Right.
really easy way to do that is to establish your identity by wearing a certain t-shirt from a certain artist, by letting others know, I like this artist, I wear my hair the same way as that artist, and I dress the same way as that artist. So that's when we start identifying with artists to show who we are.
Mm,
We will when we get to college, now we've got bigger concerns, and this is when, kids who are more interested in, I don't know, sports or other sorts of things will just kinda stick with what they know, the familiar musical path that they know. There's no reason to go out and seek innovative music,
right.
but that subsection of young people who truly get neural rewards from investigating new music are gonna keep being investigated as their lives roll forward. So, those of us who work in music, musicians and DJs and people who just have a lifelong love of it will keep exploring new styles. An interesting thing is that our brains are going to want the same sorts of treats, but our
Mm,
brains are okay with finding those treats in different styles of music because if you're 17 years old, it's socially acceptable to like heavy metal. If you're 57 years old, not so much.
right.
Yeah,
Right.
research has shown that the personality and cognitive profiles of young males who love heavy metal is nearly identical to older
Hmm.
males who love classical music. They're the same
Fast.
listener, the same listener. They're listening for complex music with a
Mm.
lot of changes in it, music that you
Right.
have to pay close attention to in order to really get and really appreciate and find the rewards
Yeah.
in listening to that music. Um, so you're the same listener your whole life, but as your life moves forward, you will be socially rewarded for certain
Right.
styles more than others.
Right. That's fascinating. So someone's listening to this and they're a producer. They want to create music that is well, like people love, people enjoy, they appreciate, that taps into all of the musical dimensions. They're thinking about this holistically. In the book, you talk about one of the important directives that you oftentimes will give students, especially producers, when they're trying to decide what something should sound like is grow the seed, don't bring the seed. Um, could you elaborate on what that means?
Oh, so, um, if you're a producer, an artist comes to you and they have something they wanna say. Music and all art are about communicating. The very first thing you have to learn is what are they trying to say? Not just with their words, but with their performance gestures, their attitude, the musical parts and sounds they choose. What are they trying to say?
Mm,
We don't well, some very successful producers do, but the majority of producers don't go in with a song and a style all chosen or all picked out for an artist and slap it on them like a coat of paint.
right.
That would merely be stuffing them into a uniform rather than pulling music out of them, the style of music that
Mm,
they naturally bring. So you have to be a really good and deep listener to hear the germ of their creativity, to hear their impulse, to hear what it is they really mostly want to express. Then you have
right.
to figure out how to make a record that expresses that. Now, you also have to assess the record's strengths and weaknesses. Does it have good lyrics? Good for
Mm,
you. You're in luck. Then you will put a frame around that vocal in your arrangement on that record.
right.
But good lyrics are hard to write, so maybe it has weak lyrics.
Right.
That's okay, maybe it's got a beautiful melody. If it has a beautiful melody, frame that. Sometimes it's not good in terms of its chord changes or its lyrics, but alright, great. Many great records don't feature a great song. You listen to Mother Popcorn or Funky Drummer, it's not a great song.
Right.
It's
Right.
great performance, it's great rhythm.
Mhm.
So you decide which aspect of this particular creation is the one that we wanna frame and showcase, and of course, you think about for whom? Are we making a record for the critics, for the general
Mm,
public? Are we trying to impress other musicians? Who do we want to like this? Important question to ask.
right. Did Prince ask that question?
I believe he did. I don't know if he ever asked it out loud, but
Right. Right. Yeah.
Because pulled such a risky move to get
Right.
to that Triple Crown,
Right.
in looking at the choices he made, it seems eminently clear
Mm,
that he knew exactly what he was doing on some level. I don't think anybody taught him this, he was just a kid, but
right.
when he
Yeah.
decided to put out Dirty Mind, his 3rd album,
Yeah.
he deliberately alienated the R&B
Uh-huh.
audience,
Yeah.
on KACE and KJLH that were listening to him. He made a record that they hated.
Right.
Why would you do that? It was so he could pick up the audience he needed, the
Mm,
critics, the ones who would write
right.
about him and make him famous, and it worked.
Yeah.
Critics in New York and LA and London and Paris, the major cities, said, "This guy's the second coming."
Mm,
A lot of people, really hate that Dirty Mind album, but for a listener like me, who likes
right.
artistic innovation, I'm like, "Oh, I liked him before, now he's my favorite
Yeah.
artist, this is so bold." For his next
Right.
record, he picked up other musicians for his next record, which was 1999, then he went after the public.
Right.
And
Right.
then for the 6th album, Triple Crown.
Right. I love it. Well, it's something that is not often discussed frequently, but like as much of a creative genius in many ways Prince was, also like a top-notch business profession and like ability to think all of those different factors and like bringing some excellent people in and knowing when to bring in experts and support and hire experts. And could you talk to me about that business side that a lot of people don't really think, like from a professional sense? What was it like working with Prince there?
Well, truly extraordinary. I wasn't involved in business decisions. He'd ask me
Right,
every now and then, and I knew that I was just giving him a naive opinion because what do I
right,
know?
right.
But, you're right. He he was a genius at so many levels, and it's really kinda hard to figure out how he did it. How
Mm,
does this kid from North Minneapolis come up
right,
and achieve the same level of stardom as Michael Jackson? Now, Michael Jackson and his brothers got there through Berry Gordy,
right.
through Diana Ross, through
Yep.
a whole Motown family. They
Old connections are
Yeah,
there. Yeah,
Michael was groomed from the time he was a little boy to be a
exactly.
star. So a lot
Right,
of people were advising them and writing songs for them and producing them and telling them this is how this works. Prince got to that same level on his own,
right.
producing his own records, being totally in charge of his own fate.
Mm,
Just one more thing that makes him truly extraordinary. I think I can only attribute it to the guy had a really high native intelligence, really
right.
smart. He,
Yeah,
he worked hard to read the world, and he worked hard to predict how he might achieve his dreams in the world that
right,
was. He really didn't like it when the label told him, "No, you can't do this. You can't have your way." For example, the Sign of the Times album was supposed to be a triple album, and that was a dark day in the studio when they told him he couldn't do that. He was not pleased,
right.
but he went into himself, he stewed,
Mm,
he pondered, and he accepted it. They
right.
were right. They were right. And he recognized that other people had good ideas too. He also had respect for authority. Someone who was a pure egomaniac would never have done that, but
Right, right.
as I said, high native intelligence, smart guy.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So, in the world of creativity, a lot of people oftentimes throw around this idea of like getting a creative block, and just like hitting a wall, not being able to create anything. From your descriptions of Prince, like did Prince run into creative blocks that you ever witnessed? Like, was that a thing?
Oh, yeah. Oh,
Okay,
yeah. You can only
love
be
to
on
hear.
yeah, you can only be on output for so long. At some point, you have to
Right,
be on input, and he was remarkable that he could spend an hour doing some non-musical thing and get inspired. The
right,
slightest little thing could inspire him. I ran out, we were working at home, and I needed to run out to the market. I think I had to get him something, and, I came back the paper bag, and in that paper bag, I had the book that I was reading, because when he'd do his vocals all by himself, I'd go in the next room and just read a book until he was ready for me. So I was reading, of all things, Goethe's Faust, Bargain with the Devil.
nice.
What got into me, who knows? But anyway, I'm reading Faust, and I had a package of, Tic Tacs,
Right,
wintergreen Tic Tacs, and, he finished his vocal. I went into the control room, he came out, I could kinda hear him rummaging around in that bag, and, next thing I knew, he wrote the song Splash, and, I just remember the line in it, "Cherry blue, wintergreen," and I seem to remember there
mhm,
was another lyric right around that same time that said something about a Faustian bargain or something like that. Um,
right,
just the slightest little thing would
right,
inspire him. Susan Moonsey, former girlfriend, took him roller skating one day. She
right,
just insisted, "You gotta get out of the studio. Let's go down to the lake and let's roller skate." And,
right,
he came back so happy and wrote the song "Strollin'" and, got a
right,
lot of inspiration from that.
right.
Yeah, but he would I guess your question was, hitting the writer's block, and yeah, of course, he would just dry up. When
Mm,
he did, we would pull from the vault older stuff that he had done, put up the tape just to see, is there anything there?
right.
Um and sometimes there wasn't.
Mm,
Sometimes he'd pull something from the vault and he'd get inspired just by listening to it, and he'd take the song in
right,
a new direction. Sometimes he'd just do some really bad art. I mean,
right.
there's some crap that we recorded that is
Yeah,
not good. Uh,
that's fair.
yeah, yeah, just a derivative and imitative
Right.
of himself and belonged in the
Yeah.
vault. Yeah.
Fair. From a neurological perspective, what does happen in the brain when you hit a creative block? Like, what's going on typically when that happens?
I wish I knew
Fair.
more about the actual mechanism of writer's block, and I will have to
Right.
get a little better versed in it. I'm
No
giving a
worries.
talk to the Society for Creative Neuroscience with, Ed Robertson from Barenaked Ladies. We're gonna talk about those
Mm,
things, but that's one of the questions I wanna answer is physically what's going on in the brain. I I
right.
I honestly don't know. We know
Mm,
from studies of creativity that it cannot be forced, that
right.
it's gonna come when it wants to come. It's
Mm,
smart for artists to recognize the conditions that are conducive to their creativity. There's so much
right.
going on in our unconscious minds that we're just not aware
Mm,
of, and so there are probably a lot of circuits in there that are just saying, I can't right now. I've got some issues, and I just
right.
can't right now." And then sometimes the ice will break and it'll flow. In the recording studio, quite naturally, the longer you're on output, the more important it is to stop and go beyond
Mm,
input, go get inspired.
right.
So I would discover that, boy, if we hit a creative wall, I would so much rather just stop. Don't
Right.
throw yourself against that wall. Go to the movies, go out for a meal, do something.
Right.
But you have to tell your brain it's okay to not have an idea right now and trust it's going to
Mm,
go into its unconscious place, especially when you're asleep, and it's going to move some stuff around to be ready for you when you need it. If you're in a situation where you can't do that, this was a
yep.
trick that I used to employ, and it sometimes worked. I wasn't embarrassed to do it. I would say to the band, okay, we got nothing. So now what I think we should do is think about the worst possible idea. What's the
Mm,
last thing this record needs right now? Didgeridoo,
interesting.
clavinet through a wah-wah pedal. What would make this record awful?
Right.
Sometimes when you hear what it doesn't wanna be, it can
Right.
illuminate its polar opposite, what it should
Mm,
be. Right.
right.
This is not working because it's a very harsh, sharp attack sound. We need something really legato here, maybe something that sounds kind of hollow and tubular. So sometimes a bad idea can trigger a good idea, and other times, and I love when this happens, it surprises you and you realize that's not bad. There's
Right.
actually something there. So, yeah,
Right.
you literally think outside of the box you found yourself in, and you just grab for anything and try it. Prince did that a lot.
Mm, right. Right. That's fascinating. You worked with a lot of artists. Do they take a similar approach that Prince would in that case?
Oh, yeah, I think so. When
Yeah.
the last thing you wanna do is beat yourself up when you're
Right.
out of inspiration. That's not
Yep.
gonna get you anywhere. You have to breathe deeply, accept
Right.
it, and recognize that you and your brain are partners here.
Mm,
And, if it's not giving you something,
right.
don't be yelling at it. It's gonna
Right.
don't be yelling at it. Let it go where it wants to go. I think of brains sometimes as taking a dog to the dog park. We keep
Mm,
our brains on a leash during the day
mm,
because we have to work, we have to take care of business, we have to there's certain things we have to do for the majority of the day, and we don't give ourselves permission to mind wander.
mm,
Especially in adults, we tend to view that as being socially unacceptable or maybe even, childish, and I
right.
disagree with that completely. We need to give ourselves throughout our entire life permission to just do nothing, to do
Right.
nothing. And also, sometimes that can involve watching something really stupid on TV,
Right.
something
Yeah.
you're really familiar with.
Right.
Your brain doesn't have to think about at all. Don't think
Right.
you're being an idiot. What you're doing is you're consuming a stimulus. It's got something for your eyes, you got something for your ears, and you're letting all those other smart circuits off the
Mm,
leash because 'cause they're not
right.
needed right now. You're watching a stupid movie. There's nothing to think about. You're just
Right.
having a good time, and that can be planting some seeds that can lead to creativity down the road.
Right. What holds people back from even getting to that point? Like, do you feel like it feels like with technology, we always have apps and phones and computers, etc. People are probably listening to this podcast right now on a treadmill.
Yeah.
They're getting notifications. They might be looking at a screen all at the same time. Having that moment to kind of just like let the brain wander. what do you think, what would be your biggest piece of advice to somebody who wants to tap into their creativity, but doesn't feel like they can even figure out how to give themselves that space?
I would advise that you get to know yourself, get to know your
Mhm.
brain. So, when we mind wander, our brain goes to fantasies that it thinks would be kind of fun. So you'll think
Mm.
about things that are appealing to you. In my case, I might, well, I was doing this last night. I couldn't fall asleep and I was remembering the 1999 tour and I was remembering Vanity Six on stage. And I was thinking, how did they come up with that idea for the cape and the gloves? And, just let it go where it wants to go. Don't control it or force it to think about a certain thing. I could have woken up and read a book or looked at my screen or something, but I didn't want to. I just wanted to go where it wanted to go. I
Mm.
owe my career to a capacity to recognize what my brain wants. When I was a little
Mm.
kid, my fantasies, my go-to fantasy was the recording studio and being there with musicians who were playing, not playing myself, helping to bring records into the world. Because my brain wanted it so badly, I was
Right.
able to point my body in such a direction that I could have that gig. Later
Mm.
on, my fantasies began to change. In my late 30s, early 40s, I began fantasizing about the natural world and
Mm.
consciousness and other species and how certain things work, how brains and minds work. And my brain was saying, I want that. I would
Right.
like that. That seems like it'd be really fun. There was no
Right.
choice. After a few years of this, I realized I got to put my body right where my brain is. I got to become a scientist. One way or
Mm.
another, I have to do this. I made probably an unconscious decision, but I chose to work with Barenaked Ladies, who would give me that pop record success I needed to financially be able to
Mm.
make my brain happy and go be a
Right.
scientist. Because I was so deeply in touch with this, uh, I haven't been wrong so far about that. The thing
Right.
that I mull over and I think I would love that. I mean, mull over for months and years are exactly I'm right. It's what I truly love. So your brain, when
Mm.
you take it off its leash, it's gonna show you who you are.
Right. Right. Some folks are going to listen to this and they're going to say, I want to be Susan. Like, how do you, what would be your advice to someone who, let's say, like, go way back into time when you were on that bus and you heard Prince's song and you were like, oh, this is my artist? Like, what's your advice to that person today who is sitting on a bus, potentially listening to a podcast, and they're like, oh, I want to work with artists. I want
Right.
to then be able to learn more about creativity. I want to go down a path like this. What would be your advice to them?
Well, I definitely advise that you do a music or an arts career first, and do a
Mm.
science career later if you wanna have 2
Mm.
careers, because the sciences will always be there, and
Right.
being a college student, a freshman at age 44 was great. That was just great for me. So I'm glad I did music first, science afterward. You'll have to understand your artistic self to the point where you have to recognize what is the one musical skill you can do that comes the easiest and the most naturally to you, because that's the skill you're going to get up to speed on the fastest. So
Mm.
imagine you're out of shape and you go to the gym and the personal trainer says, "All right, we got to work on this."
Right.
Some maybe your arms are better than your legs or your abs or whatever. So you got some muscles that are pretty well developed and others that need to start from ground zero. It's
Mm.
a myth to think we've got to develop our skill sets in parallel. I don't
Right.
know anyone who's successful in this business who did that. We
Right.
develop our skill sets in series because you have to be able to show the world that you can be world class great at
Right.
something. That might be
Mm.
songwriting, it might be singing, it might be beat making, it might be any number of things. Um, but once you show that you can get up there to speed,
Right.
commercially successful really fast, then the world will give you opportunities to add to your skill set. So, for my example, of all the things I could do, well, I sure as hell couldn't write or play or sing. I wasn't going to be that. There was no way
Right.
they were going to let a young woman in 1978 walk down
Mm.
that road of record producer. Yeah, that's not going to happen. I
Right.
knew down deep inside I'd be the world's worst record executive. I don't have those kinds of, I just don't solve those kinds of problems. I don't know how.
Right.
I wouldn't be a good DJ. I wouldn't be a music business manager. But when I
Mm,
thought about the option of being an audio technician, studying
right.
electronics, repairing equipment, I knew right
Yeah.
away, yeah, my dad is really mechanical, my brothers are mechanical. That's just gonna be really easy for me, relatively
Right.
easy. And that worked. Got up to speed on that first, added the engineering and mixing skills, and through working with a lot of different great producers, was able to add production a little bit later, got
Right.
successful, able to add science career later.
Right. I love it. That's great. A question for you, and this kind of goes back to one of your earlier points around two things that you mentioned. Prince had really great ability to focus, as well as the ability to kind of just have that flow of creativity. Could you talk a little bit around the combination of those two things and how they're related? Focus and creativity, and how they result in like great outcomes, like the ability to focus and allow the mind to wander to come up with the flow and great end result. Could you just talk a little bit around like the relationship between those two things?
Yeah, scholars of creativity note that what defines creativity is at least 3 points, and I can't for the life of me remember what the 3rd point is, but I mentioned the first 2 earlier. One is originality and the second is usefulness. If you're going
Right.
to make something, you have to have a capacity to understand who it's gonna work for, how it's gonna work when it goes out there in the world. Does this is this idea something that deserves to be made, or is this
Mm,
just a really bad idea? Um,
right.
I don't know how that relates to focus so much, but highly
Mm,
creative people do have a capacity to tune out a certain percentage of irrelevant ideas and to
right.
keep revising their work in progress until it meets the standard that they're imagining in their mind. Other
Right.
people get started on a creative idea, and because they love the act of creation so much, they don't really have a strong sense of follow through. They will
Mm,
abandon projects before they're really done because often they'll lose this notion of what's good about it, or this notion of who's this going to be useful to.
right.
I'm
Right.
thinking of a song, um, the Prince recorded. It's called "I Am 5." He recorded it before I joined him. Lyrically, it's a little bit, risque and could even
Mm,
be offensive to some people. "I am 5." It was way out of left field for him. It wasn't typical of what he normally did. When they were considering whether or not to include it on a box set of stuff from the vault, I was in favor of releasing it because I thought it would show who he is. But others were smarter and they recognized, no, we don't want to include this because it wasn't consistent with the
mm,
image of music that Prince put out there in the world. So you have to have a sense of your own uh, artistic identity so
right.
that you can make things that serve that identity. An important point to consider while we're on this topic is that in the case of Prince, any artist, Prince music was only a
Mm,
portion of the music of his life.
mm,
Of his entire musical life, there was Prince music, the Time music, Sheila
right.
E., Vanity 6, and that's the
True.
same for all artists. Sometimes you just have a hankering to adopt an alternative identity so that you
Right.
can express another aspect of your artistry. Most of the time, we can't get away with that. We pick a lane and we kinda have to stay in it. Even if our creativity could go to other places, we gotta stay in our lane for the consistency and the usefulness of the product.
Right. No, that's fair. So I've got two final questions, and I'm very curious to get a sense of you to kind of do these. We do them with all of our guests. Before you became a scientist, what do you wish you would have known?
I wish I would have known that my brain, your brain, everyone's brain is so capable of learning new things. I didn't
Mm,
realize that I'd ever have a career other than the career I had when I was first
right,
starting out. I mean, really, my ambition was just to be a really great technician, and then I got lucky and I got to be an engineer and mixer. Then I got even
right,
luckier and I got to be a producer. But I thought, okay, that's it. You've achieved
right,
more than you ever thought possible. When I started school, I was really scared, thinking, I don't know if I can do this. The other kids might not wanna sit next to me, and the teachers might not want an older student, and boy,
right.
was I wrong, wrong, wrong.
Mm,
an older brain learns really, really well. It doesn't have the hormonal fluctuations. It doesn't have the
Right.
social pressures to date or hang
True.
out with people.
Yeah.
College years were the happiest days of my life, and those were in my 40s and 50s. So I wish I had
Right.
known that. I wish I had known how that a rich and active brain, can keep
Mm,
working for you your whole life.
right. Right. So my last one would be, in order to be a great scientist, what have you learned as being kind of the most important skill to develop and constantly work on for yourself?
It's the same thing we talked about earlier. It's self-discipline and focus. I was
Mm,
watching Jerry Seinfeld's Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee, and he was with some comic, and they were talking about a friend of theirs who wasn't very successful because he was easily distracted, and Jerry Seinfeld said a sentence that I thought was so great, I just wrote it down. He said, "Lack of focus is the single biggest enemy of greatness."
mm,
Lack of focus. It's so important to engage focus and self-discipline. No one's gonna give you any more hours. We all got the
right.
24 in a day. No one's gonna give you any more, and if you want or need more hours, you have to take them away from something else. So,
Right.
you're not gonna get to do everything you want to do. It's not possible. That's why it's important to know yourself, because 'cause you're probably
Mm,
gonna do the thing you want the most.
right. Susan, thank you so much. This has been great. Really appreciate the time. If listeners want to learn more and find out more about you, where should they go?
Oh, I think it'd be nice to have them, show up on thisiswhatitsoundslike.com. That's the title of the book. There up at the top, there's a record pull. Click on the record pull and put in a record that just makes you swoon. I've, uh,
Mm,
I've had this cold, so I haven't gotten back to commenters this week, but normally I check out everything that people post there and I reply to them, and I've gotten turned on to some favorite new artists just from what people have shared, so yeah, join the record poll. Put
I
your
like it.
choice up there.
Sounds good. Thank you so much. And I would strongly encourage folks to check out the book, What It Sounds Like. It's been one of my favorite reads for 2023 so far. Definitely opened my eyes to the wonderful world of music. So thank you so much, Susan, for what you do for the industry, for creativity, and your work. It's been great to chat with you today. And I look forward to following more of your work in the future.
Thank you so much, Ross, and, if there's an opportunity when I can come on again, maybe talk about something else, I would be delighted. Good luck to you.
Thank you. Take care. Have a great day. And I hope you're feeling better soon.